It starts at Buckingham Palace during a formal reception for foreign dignitaries. The state dining room, full of guests, formal dress, the entire weight of royal ceremony on display. Charles is there, moving through the room the way he always does at these events, composed, measured, every gesture deliberate. And then he drops. Not a stumble, not a moment of unsteadiness he recovers from. He physically collapses in front of a room full of people. Security moved within seconds. And the first thing they did was not call for a doctor. The first thing they did was start taking phones. Every guest in that room had their device removed before a single image could escape. That tells you something immediate about how this palace operates under pressure. The instinct was not to help first. The instinct was to control the information first. Guests were moved out through side exits. Doctors arrived through an entrance most people inside the building did not even know existed. And by the time the medical team left Charles's private chambers, the palace clocks were showing nearly midnight. Whatever those doctors said to him in that room, it never made it outside those walls. The palace released nothing. No statement, no clarification, no details. Just silence, which, in a household built on the careful management of public image, is its own kind of answer. Now stay with me here, because this is where the timeline starts doing something very strange. Weeks after the collapse, Charles appeared on camera, calm, controlled, looking directly at the lens. And he told the public that his treatment could be reduced in the new year. That landed exactly the way it was designed to land. Relief. Exhales. The sense that things were stabilizing, that the situation was moving in a better direction. It was carefully chosen language built around one specific word, reduce. And that word did exactly the work it was supposed to do. Except here is what was happening behind that camera at the exact same time. His medical team had pulled him aside that same week and delivered a completely different assessment. A second marker in his condition had shifted. It was moving faster than they had anticipated, faster than their treatment plan had been designed to handle. And the message they gave him privately was not one of reduction. It was one of acceleration. So you have two completely parallel realities running at the same time. The public version, which was technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense, and the private version, which told a man that whatever time he thought he had was probably shorter than he knew. Someone inside that palace made the call to bury the second assessment, to let the public statement stand alone while the real picture stayed locked inside. And that buried truth is not a footnote to this story. It is the entire reason everything that followed happened at the speed it did. Because when you are a king who has just been told in a cold private consultation that your timeline has compressed in ways nobody is ready for, you stop thinking about schedules. You start thinking about what gets left unfinished. Okay, stay with me, because this next part is where everything shifts. Charles's private secretary reportedly urged him to wait until morning, to sleep on it, to let the night pass before making any permanent decisions. Charles refused. Whatever those doctors had said to him, it had already made waiting feel like a risk he was not willing to take. So instead, the royal solicitor was contacted after midnight, pulled from sleep, rushed to the palace, and brought into a room where a document was already waiting. This document, under any normal circumstance, would have gone through months of legal preparation, quiet discussions behind closed doors, careful negotiation between relevant parties, the kind of deliberate process that keeps a decision like this from blindsiding anyone. Charles compressed all of that into one room, one night, one signature. And before he signed, the solicitor asked him twice, whether he wanted Camilla or William present. Twice, he said no. That detail is the one that changes the entire shape of this story, because this was not a rushed moment with no time to think. There was enough time to ask the question, and enough time for Charles to consider it twice. He had the option to call his wife. He had the option to call his heir. He looked at both of those options and shut them out. The only people in that room when Charles signed were the royal solicitor and the most minimal number of witnesses legally required. No family, no counsel from the people who would inherit the consequences of what he was writing. When it was done, he said 3 words. Exactly 3. It is done. No expression beyond those words. No visible relief. Just a flat, quiet finality from a man who had been carrying a decision for a long time and had chosen this particular dark, silent hour to make it irreversible. Now, some of you are already asking whether he could actually do this, whether a king can sign away control over something that significant without asking anyone for permission, without a vote, without any formal process outside of that one room. The answer is yes. And the reason comes down to something called royal prerogative. The British monarchy operates under a framework that grants a reigning monarch direct personal authority over anything tied to the crown itself. No parliamentary approval required. No committee, No process outside the monarch's own judgment. The crown jewels fall entirely within that authority, which means everything Charles did that night was completely legal. But legal and unusual are two very different things. The shock inside the palace was never about whether he had the right. It was about the speed. It was about the fact that he took a decision that should have moved slowly, carefully, over years, and forced it through a single midnight window, while everyone who would have had something to say about it was asleep. That speed is its own statement. It tells you exactly what Charles believed about how much time he had left to make it. And when you put that decision alongside what those treasures have already endured across centuries, deliberately destroyed once in a calculated attempt to wipe the monarchy out of existence, physically stolen from the Tower of London by someone trusted enough to get that close, survived across 2 world wars, revolutions, and the collapse of multiple empires, the weight of what Charles did in that room becomes even harder to absorb. All of that history, all of that survival, and the next chapter of it was decided by one man, alone, in the small hours of the night, with nobody else in the room who loved him. But while Charles sat with what he had just done, someone else in that palace was seconds away from finding out that everything she had believed about her place in this family was not what she thought it was. Camilla did not hear about the guardianship order from her husband. She heard it from a staff member, hours after it was signed, delivered in that particular careful tone people use when they already know the words are about to cause damage, and they are trying to minimize how much of that damage lands on them personally. The second she heard it, she was already moving. She went straight to Charles's study, and in the momentum of getting there, she did not fully close the door behind her. A staff member positioned nearby caught the entire exchange. Every word. She told Charles directly that he had made her irrelevant, that he had done it while she was still standing beside him, while she was still his wife, still in the same building, still breathing. His response was not an apology. He told her the crown was never something a wife keeps. It was only ever something she was allowed to borrow. That sentence, spoken plainly, without softening, without any apparent awareness of how it would land, stripped away decades of careful presentation in one moment. He was not speaking to her as a partner. He was speaking to her as a monarch, reminding a consort of the terms of an arrangement she had always been in, but had perhaps chosen not to fully examine. And the terms are brutal, when you actually lay them out plainly. A consort does not inherit the throne. A consort does not inherit access to the jewels. A consort is permitted to wear certain pieces on certain occasions, at the direct pleasure of the reigning monarch, and when that monarch dies, most of that access ends automatically. It does not transfer, it does not continue, it stops. Camilla had known this the way people know uncomfortable truths that are easier to leave in the background. It existed in some distant, abstract corner of her understanding of the role she had stepped into. But hearing it spoken to her face, in the same breath as learning that another woman had just been handed permanent, legally documented, total control over those same pieces, turned something abstract into something immediate and personal and raw. Here is what makes this confrontation more than just one explosive night. Long before that study, long before that signed document, Camilla had quietly approached the palace jewelry office about a specific historic diamond necklace. There was a state visit coming up that carried personal significance to her, and she wanted to wear it. She was told the request needed further review. That review never happened. No response ever came. The request just disappeared into the same institutional silence this palace has been perfecting for generations. 2 years later, that exact necklace appeared around Catherine's neck at a state dinner. No warning to Camilla. No conversation. No acknowledgement that the request had ever been made. Camilla found out the same way the public did, watching it happen on her television screen in real time. She did not say a word publicly. Not one. She attended the same events, stood in the same photographs, smiled through every camera moment as though nothing had happened. And she kept doing that through every occasion that followed. But according to people who have worked closely with her over many years, she was keeping something else alongside that public composure. A private, careful record. Every time something she had quietly asked for showed up later on someone else. Every slight that never received an acknowledgement. Every moment where her position in this family was quietly diminished while the cameras were pointed somewhere else. On its own, any single entry in that record looks minor. A piece of jewelry, a missed conversation, a request that got lost. But stacked together across years, they form a picture of a woman who has been methodically cataloging her own erasure while the world watched her smile through it. That kind of accumulated, patient, quiet anger is a very specific thing. It does not fade the way loud anger does. It does not exhaust itself. It compounds. And it was already compounding when she stood in that study doorway and said something the staff member nearby never forgot. She said she refused to be the second wife erased from two histories at once. That line lands differently when you understand the weight behind it. Because the first erasure was not Catherine. The first erasure was Diana, the woman whose memory Camilla has spent the better part of 3 decades being measured against, compared to, found lacking beside in public opinion. That wound has never fully closed, and now, in the same night, she was being positioned as the woman passed over in favor of someone a generation younger. A woman who was not even inside the building when a decision about Camilla's own family's future was being made, pushed aside twice, in the same lifetime for the same essential reason, that she would always be framed as the one who came second. Charles did not follow her when she turned and walked out. He stayed seated. He looked down at the document on the table in front of him. The gap between them in that moment, with her fury walking out the door and him not moving to close it, says more than anything either of them said out loud. In the days that followed, people close to the household described Camilla as noticeably different, withdrawn in a way that stood out. She missed a series of minor engagements she would under any other circumstances have attended without question. When reporters asked her directly about Catherine's new role, she said nothing, gave them nothing, just silence. And silence from Camilla, a woman who has spent her entire time inside this family learning when and how to manage what the public sees, is not nothing. Silence from someone that practiced at presentation is itself a decision. The question nobody inside that palace can answer right now is what that silence is building toward. Whether she is processing this the way she has processed every other slight, filing it away, eventually returning to form, continuing to perform the version of herself the crown requires. Or whether something in that study, in those 3 words from Charles, in the weight of a second history being written without her in it, finally crossed a line that composure cannot walk back from. A woman who has kept a private record for years does not simply forget the night she was called a borrower inside her own home. And whatever she does next, whatever direction that accumulated silence decides to move in, every person watching this family closely should understand one thing. The document is signed. The decision is made. Catherine now holds something that cannot be unsigned. And Camilla is walking through that palace every single day knowing exactly what was taken, exactly when it happened, and exactly who was in the room when it did. What happens next inside those walls is not a question with a clean answer yet, and that is precisely why you need to stay close to this channel. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe to Prime Royal Central and like this video. We go deep on every layer of what is happening inside this family, and there is significantly more to this story still ahead. The next part of this is going to take everything that happened in that midnight room and show you exactly how the people who were shut out of it are beginning to respond. Because Charles signed a document, but the people he chose not to invite into that room have not signed anything. And that changes everything that comes next. So here is where we left off. A document signed at midnight. A wife who found out from a staff member. A king who looked at the 2 people closest to him and deliberately chose to keep them out of the room. And now, the woman whose name is on that document, the woman who just inherited legal control over the most powerful symbols of the British monarchy, was already buckling before the ink had fully dried. Because here is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about Catherine receiving this guardianship order. She did not want it handed to her this way. Not like this. Not at this speed. Not while the family around her was still bleeding from the decision. Before any of it became official, Catherine had looked Charles directly in the eye and asked him to wait. Not permanently. Not indefinitely. Just long enough for the immediate pain of it to settle before it became irreversible. She was not asking him to change his mind. She was asking him to give the people he claimed to love enough time to breathe before he upended everything. Charles said no. And that answer, delivered without softening, without negotiation, told everyone paying attention exactly how compressed his sense of time had become. A man who still believed he had years ahead of him does not refuse to wait a few weeks. A man who has been told something privately that changes his entire calculation does. Now watch this closely, because understanding what Catherine was walking into requires understanding what she had already walked through to get there. Catherine did not arrive at this moment from a position of comfort or ease. She built her path with her own hands, working inside her family's business, learning through years of unglamorous effort what it actually means to earn something rather than inherit it. That foundation mattered. It shaped the way she operates inside an institution that has swallowed more than a few people who were not prepared for what it demands. And then, before any of this with the jewels or the midnight order or the family fracture, cancer came for her. She was forced out of public life for months. The world filled that silence with speculation, with rumor, with the particular cruelty that follows anyone who steps out of the spotlight without a complete explanation. She did not respond to it. She recovered quietly, without complaint, without asking for sympathy, and she rebuilt her presence piece by piece until she was standing beside a visibly declining king at official engagements, where every person in the room understood exactly what her being there was meant to signal. She had already survived something most people in her position would not have come back from at full strength, and now she was being handed something heavier, with no finish line attached and no clear picture of what winning even looked like. Okay, stay with me, because this next part matters enormously for understanding why Charles made the specific choice he did. Catherine had done something inside this institution that is genuinely rare. She had made the monarchy feel relevant to people who had grown up with no particular emotional connection to it. Old pieces, jewels that had spent years sitting untouched in storage, beautiful but invisible, meaningful only to historians, appeared on her at carefully chosen moments, and something shifted. The public responded in ways that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Pieces that had been overlooked for decades suddenly became part of a wider conversation about history, identity, and what this institution actually means to the people it exists alongside. People who study this family professionally described it as an instinct, not a strategy assembled in a communications meeting, but a genuine, almost intuitive understanding of how to connect old symbols to living people. And that instinct, that specific, rare, difficult to manufacture quality, was precisely why Charles trusted her with all of it, even as the decision tore through his marriage. Even as it detonated the careful peace that had existed between the two women in his life, he was not thinking about managing the immediate fallout. He was thinking about what happens to this institution 20 years from now, and who was the one person capable of carrying it there without letting it quietly fade into irrelevance. He placed his bet. He signed the document. And now the question is what exactly Catherine is actually holding. Take a look at this for a moment, because the full scope of what just landed in her hands is not something most people have stopped to examine carefully. This is not a ceremonial title. This is not a symbolic gesture dressed up in formal language. Catherine now holds sole legal guardianship over the entire collection of the British monarchy's crown jewels, every piece, under her name alone. The imperial state crown sits at the center of that collection, covered in diamonds whose combined value exceeds what most nations hold in their national treasuries. This is the crown worn at the state opening of Parliament, the crown that travels in its own dedicated car, the crown that represents the functioning authority of the British state in its most formal expression. Then there is St. Edward's crown, more sacred still. So significant, so deliberately protected, that it is only removed from its case once in an entire generation. At the precise moment a new monarch is crowned in front of the world. It does not appear at ceremonies, it does not get worn for events. It comes out for one purpose and one purpose only, and then it goes back. And then there is the Cullinan diamond, the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever discovered, cut from the earth under mining conditions that cost workers their lives, workers whose names were never recorded, never acknowledged, never remembered in any official account of how that stone arrived in British hands. But the piece with the heaviest history of all is the Koh-i-Noor. Now, the Koh-i-Noor's history does not read like the story of a jewel passed carefully between admiring hands across generations. It reads like a series of violent transfers, each one more brutal than the last. Previous owners were blinded. Others were subjected to extreme coercion until they surrendered it. Some were killed by rivals who wanted it badly enough to remove any obstacle between themselves and possession of it. The stone changed hands through conquest, through betrayal, through the specific kind of ruthless ambition that tends to cluster around objects people have decided are worth any cost. And even today, more than one sovereign nation formally and publicly maintains that it was not gifted to Britain, that it was removed, taken during a period of colonial history the crown would prefer to leave undiscussed in any official setting. Diplomats from those nations have raised the issue at formal functions, quietly, politely, consistently, and have been met each time with the same practiced deflection that this institution has perfected across generations. Catherine has not inherited a beautiful piece of history to admire and protect behind glass. She has inherited a diplomatic dispute that multiple governments consider unresolved. And whether she fully understood what was attached to that guardianship order when Charles placed it in her hands or not, the legal responsibility for navigating that dispute now sits on her shoulders specifically. That weight does not come with instructions. It does not come with a roadmap. It comes with centuries of complicated, contested history, and the expectation that she will carry it without letting any of it publicly unravel. And here is where the historical context of these treasures stops being background information and starts being something that directly shapes what might happen next. This collection has been destroyed before. In 1649, the entire original set was deliberately melted down. The gold was stripped. The stones were sold. It was not an accident or a theft. It was a calculated, deliberate act of institutional erasure, an attempt to wipe the monarchy out of existence by dismantling the physical objects that represented it. And yet by 1661, the tradition had clawed its way back from nothing. Rebuilt from the ground up by people who refused to accept that it was finished, it has also been stolen, exactly once, in 1671, by a man named Thomas Blood. And the method he used should tell you something important about where the real vulnerability in any system of trust actually lives. Thomas Blood did not force his way in. He did not overpower anyone or break through any barrier. He spent months building a friendship with the keeper of the vault, shared meals with him, earned his confidence slowly and deliberately until the keeper had no reason to suspect anything. And then, when the trust was complete and the access it provided was total, Thomas walked into the Tower of London and attempted to leave with the imperial state crown hidden beneath his coat. He was caught. And then, in a detail that historians have been debating ever since, the king of that era pardoned him entirely rather than executing him. Some argue the king simply respected the audacity of it. Others suggest quietly that Thomas Blood knew something about the crown that made keeping him alive a safer option than silencing him permanently. Either way, the lesson embedded in that story is uncomfortable. The treasure was only ever successfully stolen by the one person the keeper trusted most completely. Now ask yourself something that nobody inside that palace wants to say out loud. Catherine is currently the person standing closest to this collection of anyone alive. She is the one with documented legal authority over every piece. She is also the one with the most at stake in what happens to it, and the people who would normally provide institutional checks on that kind of concentrated access, the ones who would ask careful questions and require careful answers, were not in the room the night the order was signed. Behind closed doors, the Crown's own legal advisors were already circling a question nobody wanted to be the first to speak aloud. When William and Catherine were granted the authority to issue royal warrants, the palace wrapped it in celebration. Statements were released. Quotes were provided. Press materials were distributed to make it feel like good news, like a normal and welcome milestone in a healthy succession. This time, there was nothing. No press conference, no public framing, no explanation offered connecting any of it to Charles's deteriorating condition. Just a quiet legal document filed in a place most people would never think to look. And that silence is its own statement, because this institution knows exactly how to generate positive coverage when it wants to. The absence of any attempt to do that here tells you more about how the people inside that building read the situation than any official release ever would. Royal historians who have studied previous reigns at length say they cannot identify another period in which this many significant powers transferred this quickly without a single public announcement explaining the reason. Each individual move, examined alone, could be framed as routine planning, the kind of administrative preparation any responsible long-reigning monarch might arrange years in advance. But these moves are not happening years apart. They are happening in sequence, at speed, dressed in silence, and stacked together in the order they have arrived. They stop looking like careful planning and start looking like a man accelerating against a clock only he can see clearly. There is something else here that goes beyond the family dynamics and the legal architecture. Something that Charles understood with complete clarity when he made his decision. Catherine has a measurable economic effect on everything she is associated with. Wherever she appears, whatever she wears, the public response is immediate and significant. Items sell out. Designers receive international attention. The places she visits draw visitors for months afterward. The pattern has become so consistent and so pronounced that people who study this institution professionally have stopped treating it as a coincidence and started recognizing it as a genuine force. Crowds respond differently around her than around almost anyone else in this family. Cameras follow her with a different kind of intensity. The public engagement she generates is not manufactured by a communications team. It is organic, and it is powerful, and it is exactly the kind of quality that cannot be taught or replicated through strategy alone. Charles saw that, and when he placed these treasures under her legal guardianship specifically, he was not simply securing their physical safety. He was ensuring that the one person capable of keeping this entire institution alive and meaningful for a new generation was also the one person now legally and permanently bound to its most sacred objects. He was chaining the future of the monarchy to the one person he trusted to carry it there. But here is what has not been said publicly until now. According to people with knowledge of private conversations happening inside the palace, at least one senior legal advisor has raised a possibility dark enough to reframe everything Catherine has just been handed. That advisor reportedly suggested that Camilla, as Charles's surviving wife, could potentially use her legal standing as his widow to challenge this guardianship order in court after Charles is gone. To argue that something this binding, this total, this historically unprecedented, transferring sole guardianship of the crown's most sacred and contested treasures to someone who is not yet the monarch, had never been attempted at this stage of a succession in this family's entire documented history, which means if that challenge ever materializes, it would drag British courts into legal territory that has never been tested. Judges would be asked to determine whether even a reigning monarch's signed order can survive a determined legal challenge from a widow who believes something was taken from her without consent. Legal scholars who study royal prerogative in depth have noted quietly that there is no clear precedent for how that kind of case resolves. Nobody has ever been in this position before. Which means Catherine could survive the confrontation, absorb the pressure, carry the weight of guarding jewels soaked in centuries of contested history, and still face the possibility that a courtroom challenge strips it all away before she ever becomes queen. Everything she has endured might not be the conclusion of this war. It might be the first move in a longer one. And then there is trooping the color. People close to the planning of that event have quietly begun using language that stands out to anyone paying careful attention. The specific kind of language that tends to surface when people who know more than they are allowed to say are preparing privately for something they cannot yet acknowledge publicly. Extra medical personnel have been added to the standard coverage of the event, a detail that has received no official explanation and no official denial. Nobody has been asked to account for it. Nobody has volunteered to explain it. It simply exists, sitting inside the public record of preparations, waiting for someone to ask the question directly. A ceremony that has run every single year across multiple generations without incident does not require additional doctors unless something has changed in the assessment of what might happen during it. People close to this family have gone further still, suggesting that quiet contingency arrangements are already being developed inside the palace, plans that nobody is naming out loud in any official capacity, but that everyone in the relevant rooms already understands the shape of. The language used around this moment by people inside that building has not been heard in this institution since the abdication crisis, the last time a sitting king made a decision so seismic that it changed the fundamental course of everything that came after. History does not arrive with a formal announcement. It does not wait for a press release or a prepared statement or a moment when everyone is ready for it. It arrives in quiet rooms, in documents signed when the rest of the building is sleeping, in jewels placed into someone's hands before the world is ready to understand what that transfer actually means. The real question was never simply whether Catherine becomes queen. The shape of that future has been visible for years to anyone willing to look at it clearly. The real question is how soon that moment arrives, whether the crown she is guarding right now will still belong to her legally and completely by the time it does. Whether Camilla's fury stays silent or finds a courtroom willing to hear it, whether the contingency arrangements being drawn up in quiet palace rooms stay on paper or become the reality everyone inside that building is already privately preparing for. Charles signed a document. He said 3 words and stayed in his seat while the consequences walked out the door. What comes next is not something anyone has a clean answer to yet, and that is exactly why you need to stay with Prime Royal Central. If this breakdown gave you something to sit with, hit subscribe right now and make sure you like this video. We are tracking every thread of this story as it moves, and there is more coming that changes the picture again. The ground underneath this family is shifting faster than the public has been shown, and when the next piece of this falls into place, you are going to want to have already been here, because the crown is in Catherine's hands. But how long it stays there, that part is still being decided.